Welcome back to our next segment. And this is a segment where at the very first segment we talked about day one pretest. You were asked to define disability and handicap. You were asked to use some person-first language, talk about universal design. And by the end of this course, if you've watched each of the lessons, if you've engaged with our activities, those questions will be so easily answered. But I suspect, and this is based on many years of teaching this class to students, college-age students, they show a remarkable lack of knowledge and a lack of experience with this kind of information. So if you didn't do well, don't be too critical. If you did well, that's great. I think that it's wonderful. So when we think about it, the first question on the pretest was, what's the difference between defined disability and defined handicap? Now again, for those of you who study this information, please know that I'm simplifying these definitions incredibly. We're not talking about all the subtleties. So when I think about disability, we talk about it as an attribute of the person. It's the deafness, it's the blindness, it's the traumatic brain injury, but it's an attribute of the person, if you will. On the other hand, handicap is a barrier. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in our lesson on language, media, and the arts, but when it comes to the idea of handicap, all of us can be handicapped. An example I'll use today, and we'll repeat again, is now if I was talking to a deaf person and we're having this chat and that deaf person used sign language, we would have a really clear conversation that says, hey, do you use sign language? How about them? Do they know sign language? Well, if they don't know sign language, then really they're the ones who are handicapped, right? And that's what we're talking about here. It depends on context. So anyone could be handicapped, depending on context, but there's only a segment of people, and we'll put that at about 15 to 20%, that actually have a disability. So I do want you to keep those two concepts separate. We will do some more practice on those as the semester goes on. The next item on the pretest was one where I asked you to use something called person-first language. Again, we'll hit that more on the lecture on language, media, and the arts, but it's the idea of putting the person before their disability and using language that's neutral. So for example, when you talk about the blind often find icy sidewalks, blah, 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 you would say something along the lines of people who are blind, okay? The person first. Or the idea of my friend is wheelchair bound, okay? Wheelchair bound is a very negative connotation. Can you imagine, confined, bound to a wheelchair? Isn't it much more positive and neutral to simply say, my friend uses a wheelchair? That would be the person-first language kind of a concept. In the same way, when we talk about the next question, she suffers from diabetes, suffers, afflicted by, victimized by, all those things paint a very negative picture versus simply saying she has diabetes. So I mention these things because I will tell you, back in the day, I thought language didn't really matter. Certainly over the years and in talking to many more people, I do recognize language has power and is critical. Provide an example of universal design. And some of you, if you're familiar with this topic, that's a piece of cake. If not, as a new topic, it's something that I hope you gain some familiarity with. It's the idea that when we create things, whether it's technological, whether it's something we're building, whether we're using in teaching, but how can we do whatever we do to make the end product be as accessible to as many as possible? So when we think about doorways, a narrow doorway is hard for everyone to get through, particularly if you have a couch, a big TV, or a wheelchair. A wider doorway, couch, TV, wheelchair, we all get through easily. Captions on a TV. If I'm in a quiet environment and I'm not bothered by things, I can generally hear what's said. But if there's any distraction, I always have captions on. Now, do I have a hearing loss to speak of? No. But is it a benefit? Absolutely. Universal design. We'll talk about that in much more depth when we talk about solutions. And then the final question I asked on the pretest was, what's the biggest problem that people with disabilities encounter? And it wasn't meant to be a trick question. I mean, is it technology access? Is it architectural access? I mean, because I think a lot of us might be drawn to that, because certainly when we see images for disability, it's typically the stick figure in the wheelchair, and so most people tend to equate disability with things that are physical, that are visible. But you know, the really biggest attitude, and you see this again and again in what people say as well as what we read, is it's attitudes. It's what are the attitudes of society as they exist relative to disability? How does society think of people with disability and what we should do about that? And that's really oftentimes, again and again, the biggest barriers where the judgments come, the stigma comes. So as we end this segment, I want to just let you know that if you didn't do well on the pretest, that's okay, because that shows there's lots of room for growth. If you did do well on the pretest, I think that's wonderful. That would put you probably in the top 5% of the students that I've worked with before, because the vast majority of them, this is a lot of brand new information. So with that, I'll end this segment, and then we'll pick up in just a moment with our final segment that will take you specifically through the course syllabus and navigation and how we can make all of this available to you on a weekly basis. With that, talk to you later.